Hi there, nice to have you with us. Your motor car and your investment portfolio. What the heck does one have to do with the other? Well, in studio with me is Lara Warburton, the MD of Imara Asset Management South Africa, to discuss that. Nice to have you in the studio.
Thank you, Jerry.
Nice to have a beautiful woman in the studio for a change. Usually I'm surrounded by grumpy old men, but...
Maybe I'll be a grumpy old woman today, you never know.
Where did this concept come up with, this link between tuning your car and tuning your portfolio? Because I found it fascinating when I read the piece.
Good, I'm glad. I think that the big issue really is that often people think that they'll put it off and leave it until later. Or they think that they have a plan in place and they've been doing things a certain way for a certain time and they'll just carry on. And clearly if they are making provision for retirement or for their future, then everything is fine and they leave it. But they don't often think about the fact that it needs to be reviewed. So I think the idea behind linking the review with an annual car service is a way of saying that just the same way you diarise to go and see your dentist or to have your car serviced, it's important to also review your financial plan. Because one of the saddest things we see is that a lot of people close to retirement start to then look at all the policies and the investments that they've made over the years and for the first time see what their money has actually done for them over that period. And usually that's too late.
How often should you be doing a financial tune-up?
The most important thing is if anything substantial changes in your life. So that would be a time that you need to then assess, have you got too much life cover, not enough investments, or sometimes the reverse, making sure that that mix is appropriate given your circumstances. If you have lots of debt, children at school, things like that, children you're supporting, then clearly you need more on the life cover side. But if you're now through all of that and starting to think about retirement, sometimes some of those life cover requirements are no longer relevant and you need to start putting more away, planning for life as opposed to planning for death. So that mix needs to change each time there's a significant life event that changes. But the other side of it is that it's also important to watch how your investments are actually doing. Mm-hmm. So one thing is putting the money away, but another thing is making sure that it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, that what you were sold is actually giving you the return that you require.
Okay, so nothing's changed in my life in the last year, let's say. How often should I be assessing that? Because
do you look at how it's performing?
I do on an annual basis, yeah.
Then
is that enough
review
time?
Taking place, yes. But it is also sometimes a good idea to get a professional opinion in terms of the mix. Because as I say, sometimes the mix might not be appropriate given your plans.
Do people plan correctly or do we just throw money at whatever we think is going to work and hope it sticks?
I think a lot of people throw money at things that they are shown or sold. Sometimes the golf course talk, this is a good share or this is a good fund or whatever it may be. And then once it's bought, it's not looked at and reviewed. And it might have been appropriate at that time, but it might not be appropriate 5 or 10 years later. So that actual selection needs to change from time to time.
Okay, and that's where the professional financial planner needs to come into the mix.
Yeah, I think also, there's been a big change in the financial planning arena. A lot of regulation coming in. The days of policy salesmen is something that, proper financial planners are trying to avoid having that connotation linked to them. The idea is that it's a professional service that's provided. Clearly that professional service also carries a fee, which is why a lot of people are averse to going and getting professional help. But invariably the savings that are made are way in excess of the fees that are paid.
In general, I mean, if you are working through a registered financial services plan, FPS? FSP.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you finding that the hidden costs that we were seeing before in service charges and all the rest, which were taken off of your policies that they were selling you, are those hidden costs coming down?
There shouldn't really be any hidden costs. The whole idea is that there is full disclosure of fees. A lot of people don't like to see all the fees because it's unpleasant, but once you've got over the initial shock, most people prefer seeing every possible fee. And the way the industry is structured now, clients should sign off any fees on any products that they are sold, and it should show the full schedule of fees. It should show everything. So a professional financial planner will show all the fees.
Okay, what sort of fees should I be looking at?
It depends on the product. Life policies typically have different fee structures to investments, and there are a range of different fees. Some investments have initial charges, some have annual charges, some have performance charges, some have exit penalties or fees when you exit. So there are a range and a host of different fees, and then depending on the layering of the product, if it's a platform, a linked administration platform with underlying funds, there'll be layers of fees for that as well. So it really will depend on the investment. But as I say, a proper financial planner should show all of those layers of costs. And they can be up to 3% on an annual basis, which sounds very high. But then I think it's also important to look at what sort of returns you're getting for that 3%. So they say if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. If you're so busy focusing on what you're paying that you're going to avoid some of the good investment opportunities, then that's also not a good decision. So the return after costs is what should be focused on, not purely the return or purely the fees.
And then on top of that, the financial planner is going to charge you a fee for the time that he spends doing the work that's expected of him to come up with the plan for you.
Correct, yeah.
I always get back to the same sort of mode in this show, because I'm always trying to find out where the asset allocations should be. How much should be in equities, how much should be in property, how much should be in cash. Is there a general sort of mix at this stage, or I think every single person who I've asked this to said, well, it depends on your situation, which I can understand, but not everybody has the privilege of being able to go to a financial planner and say, this is where I am, what should I be doing?
It's a difficult one because I'll give the same answer all your other guests have given. It does depend on circumstances. And I'll give an example as well. A person in their 90s who is investing money that he or she will never acquire during their lifetime. Now, many would argue that because of the age of the person, the investment must be short-term in nature. But actually, that person's not investing for themselves. They're investing for their heirs. So actually, it could be a long-term investment for education of grandchildren, in which case it could have a very high equity component. The big issue, I think, is one about risk profiling and understanding what sort of risk people can tolerate. Some people will open an investment statement and panic because they see that the value of their investment has fallen, and that will cause them sleepless nights. So for a person who has that view, regardless of their age or their life stage, an equity investment with the higher volatility that you see in equity markets is going to be frightening. A financial planner should try and explain and educate and teach that those risks are very time dependent. So if you have got time on your hands and you don't have to sell when you see that unpleasant statement, then you can afford to take on more equity risk. And I think one of the big challenges is that a lot of young people don't understand equities, shares, and as a result feel uncomfortable with the perceived risk behind a share portfolio without understanding that if they're investing for 20 or 30 years or 40 years, they can afford to take that risk. So sometimes a person's risk aversion will force them into a lower equity portfolio than they should probably be taking if they're looking to really grow their capital over the longer term.
Okay, so if I'm 20 years old now and I'm at varsity, and I've got some spare cash, what would your advice be to me?
A unit trust. Start a debit order or a lump sum. The minimums are usually low to get into unit trusts. And it's also difficult because some 20-year-olds are saving up for a deposit for a car or a townhouse or something, in which case their investment time horizon is quite short. But if they're saying they're prepared to put the money away and not have a time frame on it, clearly if the markets do well in the next 2 or 3 years, they would then be able to take that money out if they wanted to buy a car or go on an overseas trip or buy a home. But if it didn't do well, they don't have to take the money out on a predetermined date. They can actually ride through the ups and downs and wait and stay in for later.
So this then comes back to an even simpler point, and it's a question of knowing how much money you earn and how much you spend and how much of that is disposable. That you can say, okay, if I'm saving for a house, I'm going to put away 200 Rand a month for a deposit. But that still leaves me with 100 Rand a month that I don't really need.
Yes.
If I'm conscientious and don't have to go out and buy that new iPhone just because it's the new iPhone.
Yeah.
And then start looking at that as your investment money.
The problem is most people, when they do a budget, they realize that there's nothing left. So the budget starts by paying everyone else, and they never stop and pay themselves. So I always say, when you start your budget, decide what percentage of your salary you think you should be putting it away. And start by saying that that money has been put away. As you've earned it, it gets packed away before you actually start your list of expenses. Because for most people, when they start writing down that list of expenses, there's nothing left at the end. And they pay themselves, their savings, last. What we should really be doing is paying ourselves first.
And I suppose that also depends on where you are in that whole life cycle as to how much money you should be putting into the savings.
But most people will say, I don't have enough. If you do a financial plan and you tell people what they need to put away, if they're planning to retire in the same style they live at the moment, they'll say, I don't have enough to put that much away. So whatever they can afford is better than nothing at all. Because if people think they'll wait until they have enough, they'll never have enough.
Are we still saving so dismally in South Africa?
Yes, we are. And the complexity of this whole environment I don't think helps either, because it's now becoming, well, it's always becoming more complex. There are almost 1,000 unit trusts in South Africa. It's very difficult for someone to pick and choose. So I don't think it's getting easier for people to make the right decisions. And a lot of people are still saving in traditional bank products, which is better than no saving at all, but it's not keeping pace with inflation.
Okay, with all of this information overload, and I'm presuming that there are, the vast majority of South Africans cannot go and sit down with a financial professional.
They can see someone in their banks. You know, some of the banks have financial planners. I'm not saying that's always going to be the best advice, but it's better than no advice at all. Because there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, I know. I'm just, you know what?
It is a minefield.
Lara, that's why lots of us just run away from this problem. Because when we start speaking to people like you, we get headaches. And because you work in this every day, I don't.
Yeah.
And it is difficult for me to.
But you know, don't be afraid of the costs, because most financial planners will only charge a fee based on the investments that they place. So a lot of business is done on risk, where the financial planner puts in all the time and the effort without necessarily charging a fee up front. So that fee will only be charged if you decide to proceed with that advice. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money.